The morning was unusually still. Fog curled around the windows of Whitehaven mansions like cautious fingers, muffling the city's noise into something distant and forgettable. Hercule Poirot sat at the breakfast table, arranging the elements of his morning ritual with perfect symmetry. A cup of tisane, a neatly folded newspaper, a boiled egg exactly 3.5 minutes old. He was not expecting the post, and yet it arrived. The envelope was peculiar, scorched at the edges, faintly scented with old smoke and lavender. The handwriting was elegant but trembling, like someone had forced their hand to remain steady despite terror clawing beneath the skin. He held it delicately, his fingers brushing the brittle paper with reverence. No return address, no stamps, just his name, written with haunting precision. Inside, a single slip of paper. Mr. Poirot, I have lived with a lie for 25 years. Now the truth demands to be heard. If I am dead before you arrive, look to the mirror with the key. Come to Ashburn Hall. Come alone. R. Elcott. Poirot read it once. Then again. His eyes, usually amused or narrowed with suspicion, grew quiet. Not thoughtful quiet, as though a part of his mind had already stepped beyond the walls of the flat and into a darker place. He passed the letter to me, without a word. I, Captain Hastings, scanned it quickly. Do you think it's a hoax? Poirot shook his head once, slowly. Nah, mon ami. This is no fiction. The edges are burned intentionally, not accidentally. The scent of lavender, specific. Not perfume, but oil. And the hand that wrote this, it trembled not from age, but fear. Deep, paralyzing fear. But look to the mirror with the key. What does that even mean? He stood with sudden resolve, adjusting his tie with a small nod of finality. It means, Hastings, that somewhere in that house, a truth is hidden. And if this R. Elcott is already dead, then we are already too late to stop the crime, but perhaps not too late to solve it. But he said come alone, didn't he? Poirot smiled faintly. A man's final wish may be dramatic, but I trust the loyalty of my companion more than superstition. You are coming with me. Where to? Ashburn Hall, he said, his voice low. In Derbyshire. The name is old. The roots are aristocratic, but something there has been rotting in the shadows for 25 years, and now it wishes to be seen. The train to Derbyshire moved like a whisper through a land still waking from the cold. The sky above was iron gray, heavy with the weight of something unspoken. I glanced occasionally at Poirot, who remained unusually quiet, gazing out the window with his fingertips pressed together, the letter still folded neatly in his coat pocket. He was thinking, not about the journey, but about what might be waiting at the end of it. When we finally arrived, a car awaited us. No driver, just a note on the dashboard. Ashburn Hall knows you're coming. It was nearly dusk when we reached it. The estate rose from a mist-covered hollow like the memory of something once beautiful. Time had not been kind to Ashburn Hall. The ivy that crept up its stone facade had gone wild, curling over windows as if trying to shut out the light. Shutters hung at crooked angles. A bell rope dangled loose, but the doors, tall and arched, were slightly ajar, as if the house had been expecting us. A woman stood in the doorway, older, rigid in posture, her face marked not by age, but by control. You must be Mr. Poirot, she said, voice clipped. And this is my associate, Captain Hastings, Poirot replied gently. She nodded. Dorcas Vale. Housekeeper here, or what's left of one. Poirot removed his hat. We are here in response to a letter, sent, I believe, by Mr. Rufus Elcott. Her lips pressed tight. He's dead. When? 2 nights ago. Found in his study. Dr. March says it was his heart. But I don't believe it. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Why? Her gaze flickered to something over my shoulder. The upper floors, the cracked windows, the silence that hung too heavy. Because this house isn't quiet anymore. It listens. And 2 nights before he died, I heard Mr. Elcott talking to someone, but no one else was here. Poirot said nothing. He looked up at the manor, then slowly stepped through the threshold. The moment we crossed it, I felt it. A strange cold, not from the autumn air, but from something older. Something inside. The foyer was tall and dark, its wood paneling polished but weary. A great chandelier hung above us, its crystals dulled by dust. Portraits lined the walls, Elkets of generations past. Some faces had been scratched out with a fine knife. As we moved deeper into the house, I noticed something subtle. No clocks ticked. No sounds echoed from the upstairs. Even our footsteps, somehow, felt muffled. Mrs. Vale led us to the drawing room. A fire had been lit, but it gave no warmth. "You'll want to see the study," she said, "but you should meet the others first." "The others?" I asked. "Those who arrived for the will reading. Not family, what's left of it, but close enough." She led us down a corridor, where we met the house's current occupants. Lydia Elcott, the late Rufus's estranged daughter, who returned from Vienna after nearly 2 decades. She was elegant, detached, with sorrow in her voice that felt rehearsed. Simon Gray, a second cousin and solicitor, leaned more on cynicism than charm. "You'll find no secrets here, Poirot," he said. "Just old bones and older regrets." Dr. Helena March, the village physician, sharp, quiet, intelligent eyes that watched everything. And finally, Roger Bexley, an antiquarian who spoke as though every sentence should be archived. None of them, Poirot noted, expressed real grief. Only curiosity, or discomfort, or both. Later that evening, we were shown the study. The room had not been touched since the body was removed. The hearth was cold, the desk still scattered with books and an upturned glass of water. But it was the mirror above the mantel that stole all our attention, cracked clean down the center, a hairline fracture running through its middle like a scar. Poirot walked to it, placed a hand gently on the frame. He wrote, "Look to the mirror with the key." "But we've seen no key," I said. "None," he said, "which means we are not looking hard enough. Either the mirror is hiding something, or someone used it to hide something long ago." He turned and looked back into the room, his eyes scanning every surface, every shadow. "Hastings," he said softly, "this house has been quiet for 25 years, but now it has begun to speak." The next morning dawned gray, as though even the sun dared not pierce the silence of Ashburn Hall. Mist clung low across the gardens, and dew streaked the window panes like tears. Poirot, as always, was up before me, seated neatly in a high-backed chair by the study door, sipping his tisane with calm precision. "Hastings," he said without turning, "do you recall how the letter ended?" I rubbed sleep from my eyes. "Come alone, wasn't it?" "Just so. A curious request. But more curious is this. If he feared for his life, why leave no clear instructions, no confession, no will, only a riddle wrapped in metaphor?" He rose, gesturing toward the cracked mirror. "We must look again. Not with the eyes, but with the mind." We began a methodical search of the study. Mrs. Vale had said the room had been untouched since Mr. Elcott's death, but Poirot examined everything as though it had been staged. The bookshelves yielded nothing unusual, rows of well-worn volumes on ethics, theology, and Victorian poetry. But behind a collection of Yeats, Poirot found a slip of paper pressed flat against the wood. It was brittle with age, but the ink had survived. She watched herself vanish, piece by piece, until only her name remained. We exchanged a glance. "Poetic," I muttered. Poirot, however, was staring at the mirror again. "No, Hastings. It is a map of grief." He stepped forward and traced the jagged crack that split the glass. Then he tapped at the paneling just behind it. Hollow. With Mrs. Vale's reluctant permission, we removed the mirror from the wall. Behind it, a faint outline was visible in the wood, a concealed panel. It opened with a click. Inside, hidden in the darkness, was a narrow compartment. Dust danced in the light as Poirot retrieved its contents: a faded velvet pouch, a yellowed photograph, and a journal bound in dry, flaking leather. The photograph showed a woman, early 20s, dressed in gray silk, hair pinned tightly back. Her eyes were solemn, unblinking, and hauntingly alive despite the passage of time. The back was signed in cursive Amelini. May 1912. Poirot turned to the journal and opened to the first page. "I do not write to be found. I write because silence has become unbearable." There was no signature, but Poirot closed the cover gently and murmured, "This is her hand." And this, Hastings, is the voice that was hidden in the mirror. That afternoon, Poirot called Lydia, Simon Gray, Dr. March, and Mr. Bexley into the drawing room. He presented the photo and the journal, watching each face as he did. Lydia paled slightly. "I've seen her," she whispered. "That portrait used to hang in my father's bedroom. He told me it was someone who betrayed him." Dr. March leaned in to examine the photo. "That's Ameline Harrow. I've heard the name before. My mother spoke of her. She vanished from this estate in 1912. There were rumors. A suicide. Or a scandal hushed up." Poirot's voice was firm but quiet. "I believe she never left this house, and that she was not betrayed, but imprisoned." There was a stunned silence. Roger Bexley cleared his throat. "Surely you're not suggesting Elcott kept a woman locked up for decades? That's madness." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And yet madness is often the architect of such cruelties. We must follow what remains of her trail." After the others left, Poirot and I returned to the study. He spread the journal pages across the desk and examined each one. The writing was uneven, scattered across years. Some pages were no more than a few lines. Others told of music drifting through floorboards, of birthdays missed, of a single lavender flower pressed between pages and left to die. But one entry chilled me more than the rest. "He tells me the outside world won't understand. That shame is safer than truth. But every night, I watch the moon rise through the slats, and I wonder, does anyone still remember my name?" Poirot closed the book. "This, mon ami, is no ghost story. It is something far more terrifying, a forgotten truth. And someone in this house has done all they can to keep it buried." I felt a shiver run through me, not from the cold, but from the realization that the walls of Ashburn Hall were not haunted by spirits, but by silence. And silence, in the wrong hands, is the cruelest weapon of all. That night, the house did not sleep. Wind swept down from the moors and coiled around Ashburn Hall like an old memory trying to get in. Floorboards creaked above, though no one walked them. Curtains stirred without cause. And somewhere in the east wing, a music box played, just once, a delicate tinkling sound, like a lullaby abruptly cut short. I rose from bed, heart pounding, and found Poirot already awake, sitting near the hearth, fully dressed, his expression unreadable. "You heard it too?" I asked. He nodded once. "Yes, Hastings, and we must follow the sound." With candles in hand, we made our way down the long, carpeted corridor toward the east wing. This part of the house had been closed for decades. Even the air smelled different, damp, stagnant, untouched by time. It was colder here, unnaturally so, as if the walls remembered. We stopped before a door that had not been opened in years. The lock was rusted, but Poirot produced a set of keys, retrieved, no doubt, with his usual quiet thoroughness. The key turned with a groan. Inside was darkness. The room was small, sparsely furnished, but not empty. A narrow bed stood against the wall, and beside it, a simple wooden table with a comb, a cracked teacup, and a bottle of lavender oil. The walls were covered in old floral wallpaper, yellowed and curling. On the bed lay an open diary, its pages gently rustling from our entrance. Poirot approached it with reverence and turned to the most recent entry. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded. They do not know I still hear them. The laughter in the hall. The piano. Sometimes I forget how many years it's been. He says I must stay, that they will judge me if I leave. But the mirror, I think, sees differently. Poirot's face was tight with quiet fury. She was kept here, Hastings, not for weeks or months, but for years. Suddenly, a voice behind us, soft shaking. I saw her. Last week. We turned to find Mrs. Vale standing in the doorway, a candle trembling in her hand. She stood at the top of the stairs, pale as ash, dressed in gray. I thought I was seeing a ghost, but it wasn't fear I felt. It was sorrow. Poirot moved to her slowly. "Mrs. Vale, this is important. Did you tell anyone else what you saw?" She shook her head. "Who would believe me? This house makes you see things." Poirot looked back toward the bed. "But sometimes it makes you remember." Back in the main corridor, we stopped before a tall mirror in the hall. a sister piece to the one in the study. Its surface was slightly clouded, but unbroken. Poirot studied it in silence, then knelt to examine the paneling beneath. He ran a gloved finger across the edge, and something clicked. A narrow drawer slid out. Inside, another photograph of Amelie, taken at a later date, older, more withdrawn. Her eyes, once wide and bright, now held a guarded emptiness. Beneath the photograph was a letter, unsent, its ink smudged. To my daughter Lydia, if ever you find this, know that I was never allowed to speak. I was not mad. I was silenced. The shame was never mine to carry. Poirot stood, his face ashen. Hastings, he said quietly, what we are uncovering is not merely a forgotten affair or a private disgrace. It is something much heavier, a life erased to preserve a man's pride. And with that we heard it again, soft footsteps, distant, almost imagined, vanishing down the far corridor. I turned sharply, but Poirot didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the mirror. There are ghosts in this house, he said, but not of the dead, only of the unheard. The following morning was cloaked in an uneasy silence. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to stir. Lydia Elcott joined us at breakfast, her eyes hollow from a night without sleep. She said nothing of the music box or the footsteps, but the tremor in her hands told us everything. Poirot, ever methodical, requested a tour of the grounds. The truth, he said to her softly, is not only locked behind doors, mademoiselle. Sometimes it lies buried, beneath roses. The gardens at Ashburn Hall had long been the pride of the estate. Even now, despite the decay within the house, they bloomed with a stubborn beauty. Ivy-choked statues, overgrown hedges, and a rose arbor that had somehow defied both time and memory. At its center stood an old iron bench and, just behind it, a rusted gate sealed with a brass lock shaped like a rose. Lydia paused as she saw it. I've never been in there. Father always kept it locked. Said it was unsafe. The stonework was unstable. Poirot held up the small brass key retrieved from Rufus Elcott's hidden drawer. Shall we see how unsafe it truly is? With a quiet click, the gate swung open. Beyond the arbor lay a narrow footpath lined with moss-covered stones. It led to a small, forgotten plot bordered by low hedges, once a herb garden, now wild. At its center stood an uneven mound of earth, covered in withered petals and creeping vines. Poirot knelt before it, his fingers brushing the soil. It is too fresh, he said softly. This ground has been disturbed in the last few years, perhaps only months. Lydia paled. Are you saying? I am not saying anything yet, but the spade, if you please. Simon Gray, who had joined us reluctantly at Lydia's insistence, stepped back. Surely this is unnecessary. My uncle was a troubled man, yes, but... Poirot silenced him with a glance. Monsieur Gray, when a man builds a tomb in his garden and guards it with a lie, we must be curious as to who, or what, he sought to keep hidden. The digging was quiet. The soil gave way too easily. It was not long before something soft yielded beneath the blade. A piece of muslin cloth, then the fragile curve of bone. A silver locket, dulled by time, emerged from the earth like a forgotten truth. Poirot opened it gently. Inside, a miniature portrait of Rufus Elcott, painted decades ago, younger, confident, and beside it, a lock of dark hair. Lydia turned away, a cry caught in her throat. It's her. Amelie. Poirot rose, brushing soil from his gloves. She died here, Mademoiselle Elcott. Not by violence, but by silence. Pneumonia, likely. Perhaps starvation. The shame he buried her with was not hers, it was his. And it festered, poisoning every breath he took in this house. Dr. Helena March stood at the edge of the garden, silent until now. There were whispers in the village. That she'd fled. That she was mad. But he never corrected them. Poirot nodded. Because for him, the greater tragedy was not her suffering. It was the risk of exposure. Simon Gray looked shaken. But why now? Why summon you, Poirot, after so many years? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Because guilt has a voice. And in his final days, it screamed. We returned to the house in silence. Lydia walked ahead, shoulders stiff, eyes wet. The broken mirror in the study awaited us, its crack reflecting everything we now knew. It was no longer a mystery. It was a confession, frozen in glass. Poirot placed the locket on the mantelpiece beneath it. "She must be named," he said. "Not whispered, not hidden. Amelie deserved better than a locked room and a grave of roses." And for the first time, the mirror did not seem to look back with judgment, but with sorrow. After the discovery in the garden, Ashburn Hall grew quieter, but not calm. That night, as wind pressed against the old windows, the house seemed to mourn not just Amelie, but years of silence. Lydia did not join us for dinner. Dr. Helena March sat in her place. Her usual poise softened. "She was real," she murmured. "I always thought the story was a myth, until today." Poirot stirred from his chair. "Guilt lingers, madam. It makes a home of places like this." Roger Bexley entered then, visibly troubled. "Years ago, I came to visit Rufus unannounced. He slammed his study door shut. Later, I heard music violin from the East Wing. He claimed it was a recording, but it felt too alive." Poirot looked at me. "We heard it too, Hastings." He stood. "There's still one place we haven't searched, the attic." The attic was cold and heavy with dust. Old trunks and portraits lined the walls. Poirot uncovered a bundle of sketchbooks. Inside, drawings of Amelie. Dozens. Captured from memory, or presence. She lived in his mind, Poirot said. He kept her here, through guilt, not love, possession. Lydia appeared in the doorway. He drew her in secret, hoping it would redeem him. But love hidden is still a prison. Poirot nodded. Now, she must be returned her name. That night, the house creaked under the weight of memory. But perhaps, for the first time, the sorrow had begun to lift. The morning brought a soft drizzle, and with it, a strange quiet over Ashburn Hall. Poirot requested Lydia to guide us to the rose garden, now overgrown, wild vines creeping over the stone path, like time itself trying to forget. Behind the arbor, the brass key turned with a reluctant click. Beneath the damp earth, a small wooden box was unearthed, weather-worn, but intact. Inside, wrapped in delicate muslin, were bones. Fragile, peaceful. Around the neck hung a silver locket. Poirot opened it carefully. A miniature portrait of Rufus Elcott stared back. Lydia knelt, her voice barely a whisper. He never stopped loving her. But love born of shame becomes cruelty. Poirot's tone was soft, yet firm. He buried her not just in soil, but in silence. But truth, mademoiselle, does not rot. It waits. Later, inside the hall, Poirot placed the locket on the mantel beside the cracked mirror. Let this be her grave and her monument. Ashburn Hall seemed to exhale. A long-held breath, finally released. In the days that followed the revelation, a subtle transformation began to take hold of Ashburn Hall. Where once silence had clung to the walls like mold, now there was movement, gentle, purposeful. Lydia Elcott, no longer burdened by her father's shadow, moved through the halls not as an heir to ruin, but as a woman determined to reclaim her family's legacy through truth. She summoned the remaining staff, the villagers, and members of the trust. With quiet conviction, she announced her intention to reopen Ashburn Hall, not as a private estate, but as a sanctuary for women burdened by silence, shame, and secrets they could no longer carry alone. Let this house, she said, her voice steady, no longer conceal pain. Let it offer shelter to those the world has forgotten. As my father once imprisoned one soul here, let 100 now find freedom. Poirot, ever composed, simply inclined his head. Mademoiselle, your act is not just redemption for your name. It is an echo of justice for the past. Bravo! The mirror above the mantel, once a symbol of secrecy and guilt, was not removed, nor replaced. It remained in its cracked, silvered silence, as if the house itself had chosen to remember. And that, Poirot believed, was its final redemption, not the erasure of what had happened, but the courage to live with it openly. As we packed our belongings to depart, Poirot paused one last time in the drawing room. He stood before the fractured mirror, his hands behind his back, his gaze steady. You see, Hastings, he said gently, justice is not always a gavel or a cell. Sometimes it is the breaking of silence. the telling of truth, the quiet dignity of memory reclaimed. Outside, the fog had begun to lift from the moors. Light filtered through the trees, as though something unseen had finally released its hold. Ashburn Hall stood still, but not hollow. For the first time in decades, the silence inside no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful. And behind its old, cracked mirror, the house finally began to breathe again. We left Ashburn Hall just as the first frost of November settled on its iron gates. The road was silent. The trees bowed in mourning, or perhaps in relief. From the carriage window, I looked back one last time at the towering manor, now bathed in a pale, forgiving light. Something intangible had shifted. Where once the estate stood as a mausoleum of silence, it now pulsed faintly with life, like a heart long dormant learning to beat again. Poirot sat across from me, hands neatly folded over his cane, eyes distant in thought. "I keep thinking of her, Poirot," I said. "Amelie. To live in the shadows for so long, to die unheard, it's unspeakably cruel." He nodded, his expression solemn. "Yes, mon ami. But the cruelty was not in her death, it was in the forgetting. When a soul is buried without remembrance, it is as if it never lived at all." I said nothing. Outside, the moors rolled by, silent as ever. Poirot continued, his voice lower now, more reflective. "You see, Hastings, truth does not always thunder down in the courtroom. It whispers through the cracks in old mirrors. It lingers in half-burned letters and shuttered wings. And sometimes it takes years, decades, to find a voice. And when it does," Poirot smiled faintly, "then even a haunted house may become a home again." In London, the city resumed its rhythm, indifferent to the tragedies buried in countryside manors. But for those of us who had walked Ashburn's halls, who had felt the weight of memory pressing against every wall, we would not forget. That house had watched, that mirror had seen, and though it had cracked under the pressure of guilt, it had also reflected something else, the capacity for truth to survive, even when hidden. That night, as we settled back into our rooms at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot carefully placed the scorched letter, the very one that had started it all, into a folder of his most significant cases. "Will you archive it as another solved mystery?" I asked. He looked at the paper for a long moment. "No," he said at last. "Not as a mystery, Hastings. As a warning, that even the most beautiful halls may hide broken things, and even the finest reputations may be built on silence." I understood then that the mystery of Ashburn Hall was not about who had done what, but about what had been done to a forgotten woman, and how one man's guilt echoed through generations. But in its reckoning, a legacy was rewritten. A daughter reclaimed her strength, and a mirror, once a witness to shame, now stood as a testament to truth endured. The case of Ashburn Hall had ended, but its lesson remained, hanging in the air like the faint scent of lavender oil in a forgotten room, subtle, persistent, unforgettable. The day we departed Ashburn Hall, the sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that seemed to hold its breath. Inside the great house, there was a stillness, different now, not the hush of hidden things, but the quiet that follows after truths have been spoken. Poirot moved slowly through the drawing room one final time, his eyes resting on the restored mirror above the mantel. Its surface gleamed once more, but the fine crack that split its center had not been polished away. It remained as Lydia had requested, a reminder of silence shattered and the cost of oppression. Down in the garden, beneath the rose arbor, the earth had been freshly turned. Amelini's grave was no longer a secret, no longer shamefully hidden. A simple stone had been placed, bearing only her name and the dates that had been lost to time. Lydia stood there as we approached, her posture strong but her eyes distant. "I always believed there was something in this house," she said softly. "Something unsaid. I hated my father for it. But now I understand. He was a man who lacked courage when it mattered most." Poirot nodded gently. "And yet, in the end, he found it. The letter he sent was a confession, of sorts. It was his final attempt to give her peace, and you clarity." Lydia exhaled slowly, glancing toward the manor. "And what of the others? What happens to people who live their whole lives pretending the past doesn't exist?" Poirot folded his hands behind his back, his voice grave. They become ghosts long before they are dead. We took our leave not long after. As the car pulled away from the estate, I turned to Poirot. You think the house will be different now? Mais oui, Hastings. The truth has a way of cleansing even the oldest stones. Ashburn Hall has been unburdened. Its shadows have names now, and names, once spoken, lose their power. I nodded, watching as the manor vanished behind a line of skeletal trees, its silhouette less ominous than before. The wind stirred the leaves, and I fancied I could hear music, soft, spectral, like a waltz fading with the season. Back at Whitehaven Mansions that evening, Poirot sipped his tisane thoughtfully, his gaze distant. "It is curious, mon ami," he said at last. "In the end, it was not a crime we solved, but a silence. And in doing so, we gave voice to a woman lost to time." "Yes," I said quietly. "And perhaps, in doing so, we reminded the living that silence has its cost." Poirot smiled faintly, and for a moment I thought of Amelini's diary, her quiet longing, her dreams of dancing alone in the ballroom. But now, perhaps, not alone. Now remembered. And so the case of Ashburn Hall came to its end, not with the clang of prison doors or the drama of the court, but with a mirror cracked, a key turned, and a silence broken.